Thank you for joining us this month for our webinar on ethics in COVID. As many of you who are loyal to this webinar series, we've been doing this for over a year and are just so delighted that so many of you return on a weekly, monthly basis for our webinars. I'm really excited today to have this webinar, third in our series on vaccine ethics. And this one is going to focus on essentially the ethics of human challenge trials with obviously particular reference to coronavirus. I'm also very excited that this particular webinar is done in collaboration with an organization called One Day Sooner. And if you've heard of it, then I'm sure you're happy to hear that they're collaborating with us. If you've not heard of it, just wait a couple of minutes and you'll get to hear a little bit more about it from one of our speakers. Please note that today's topic is going to focus on the ethics of human challenge trials. I know that some of you might be experts on it. I'm looking forward to engaging you in a robust discussion. We will try and ensure that we have a good opportunity to have a Q&A with some of our esteemed speakers. Please remember that if you're a student, your professional category hours can be signed off by Dr. Paul Ndebele, and Kathleen will assist in that. Please, if you could, ensure that you're on mute and feel free to use the chat board for questions, comments, and reflections. So ladies and gentlemen, we all know that the current COVID pandemic has really brought on a number of interesting and important ethical challenges. One of them is the issue of doing studies with reference to developing solutions, and particularly vaccines, and the concept of human challenge studies, which of course we know from other diseases as applicable here. I'm very excited today to first welcome Josh Morrison as our first speaker for today. Josh is the executive director of One Day Sooner, the organization that I mentioned specifically. It's an advocacy group for research participants, including those that participate and can participate in COVID-19 challenge studies. Josh has previously founded a number of organizations, including advocacy groups on behalf of kidney donors, and also working to promote skill sets for incarcerated populations and looking at things like the Rikers Debate Project. Kathleen, you can actually stop sharing the introductory slide. I'm going to request Josh to start sharing his slide set. Josh is a lawyer, very well trained, has published extensively as well in popular media. I'm going to request him to unmute now and provide us an introduction to both his work and his organization. Over to you, Josh, and thank you so much for joining us today.
All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be here. Can you see my slides yet? It says sharing.
Yes.
Okay, great. So basically what I'm going to talk about today is first just tell you a little bit about what One Day Sooner is, and how I think we're a little bit novel as a concept for an organization. I'll give a little bit of background on challenge studies in general, talk about why you might want a COVID challenge studies, why we've advocated for COVID challenge studies, and also give a few sort of reasons that are given against doing COVID challenge studies. Hopefully I can do a bit of justice to those as well. So starting out, let me get to my PowerPoint there. First, there we go. Okay, so One Day Sooner is a group that was born in COVID about a year ago, in March 24th, as I first started working on this. And we've mainly been advocating in support of a COVID challenge study, but our mission is actually a little more complicated than that. We're not a group that's intended to advocate for the studies. We advocate on behalf of the volunteers, which is slightly different. And the difference is that we see ourselves in our kind of long-term future post-COVID as a kind of union of research participants, particularly a union of challenge volunteers, in a certain sense, which is a kind of liberal sense, a sense of helping the autonomy of our volunteers. So our main goal in doing this is not to primarily improve compensation or reduce risk for volunteers, but to ensure that the people who want to be pushing the frontiers of research as research participants, these sort of challenge volunteers, are both able to participate in these studies. These studies happen that can be of high value, both to the scientific community and to creating vaccines and treatments and improving our understanding. And also, actually improving the say that that group of people and the research participants in general have in research policy overall. And you see here a few of our pictures of our challenge volunteers. And we've had more than 35,000 people have signed up, with One Day Sooners being interested in participating.
I apologize for interrupting, Josh.
Sure.
Are you on? We are seeing the first one.
Oh, when I click, it moves forward. Hold on. It says sharing is paused. Bring your, let's try to, sorry about that.
Yeah, maybe now start sharing again.
Yep.
You wouldn't mind. Okay. There we are. Now at the slide showing 35,000.
Okay. And then let me go back to PowerPoint. All right. Now does the slide show existing challenge models?
Yes. Yes, it is.
Great. So yeah, like I mentioned, sorry about that. So like I mentioned, 35,000 volunteers from all over the world. A slight plural, or sort of we're slightly under the majority are from the United States. We also have a very large portion of people from Brazil, and also significant numbers from England, Canada, continental Europe, and elsewhere. So it's very broad based. And we, like I was sort of mentioning, we've advocated, not just to do the research, but also we want to make this research as good as it can possibly be. And so part of that, as challenge studies as COVID challenge studies have started in England, we've been trying to improve the quality of those studies by, for example, advocating that the protocols and study materials are public before studies begin. Or at least kind of that there's this real-time transparency, which we hope to be something we can do in challenge studies, something we can advocate for effectively with challenge studies, and then maybe for the field overall. Okay, so what is a challenge study, or what are some of the examples of existing challenge models? So it's it's the more technical way of describing it is a sort of controlled human infection model. And the term model is important there because it's not, actually natural infection. You don't naturally, get infected by being, exposed with like a pipette, which is what we're doing for COVID. And so it's not the same as natural infection, but it's meant to be a model of natural infection. And we've developed these models for a number of different diseases. Here I've listed a few of them: influenza, malaria, RSV, dengue, typhoid, cholera. In England, for about 40 years, there was a common cold research unit where they would deliberately infect people with cold viruses. And some of the things we know about coronaviruses, or knew prior to COVID, actually come from these challenge studies. And so then, when I talk about kind of the uses of these studies, I'll kind of talk, starting with COVID, but you can kind of see the uses in other places as well. All right, so this is the kind of basic way to think about why do a challenge study is that there are things you can learn with that research tool that are harder to learn with kind of natural history or other observational studies, because with a challenge study, you can control the moment of exposure and you can observe it up close from the very beginning. So you're able to see both how the disease infects people and how the disease works, and how the immune system responds to the disease right from the very beginning. So it's this kind of useful research tool to address interesting questions. And here we this is a quote from a New England Journal of Medicine piece published by the NIH Active Group about COVID challenge studies. And it gives some examples of how it can study immunopathogenesis, some of these things I mentioned about the course of the disease, duration of immunity, and correlates of protection. I'll get more into correlates of protection in a second. And so one thing we think would be useful, we think of challenge studies as being about, it's natural to think, oh, this is a study of people who haven't been infected yet, which is what the current studies are. But once you have that model, you can then see, well, let's say that we try to infect people who have been infected before, so-called seropositives, or people who are vaccinated, and you can determine what it is that separates people who then get the disease versus who don't get the disease. And that helps produce that helps teach us what are called these correlates of protection. And why this matters from a COVID perspective is, we have some decent sense of correlates of protection in terms of just the amount of neutralizing antibodies. And so it might be that simple, but there can be other things, it can be much more sophisticated or complex than that. And being able to definitively establish these correlates of protection is a way that you can approve vaccines because they produce these correlates even before you learn about efficacy, even before you can prove that the vaccine actually reduces infection or it reduces symptoms directly. If you know it produces the things that are definitely going to protect against infection, then you can feel good about recommending the vaccine. And so here's this point again about pathogenesis. And the final thing is that, one way that challenge studies are used are actually to test vaccines and treatments and give this sort of signal of efficacy, because you're able to use a much smaller population in that context and study them a lot more closely. Now, there's obviously, I think there's two things to mention here. One is that challenge studies are not a kind of panacea. They're not a complete substitute for other ways of testing efficacy in two major ways. One is that you still need, if you're testing a vaccine, to do safety testing in large groups of people, but you might be able to complete that more quickly than you can complete efficacy testing. And the other thing is that, like I've said, this is a model of infection and of the disease, and it's not the same as natural disease. So it's not it doesn't line up perfectly. Though there have been vaccines, particularly the Kova vaccine for cholera that's used by American travelers, that have been approved on the basis of efficacy data for these challenge studies. Now, there's a question of, why challenge studies now? Or, does it still make sense to do these studies now that we have these vaccines? And I think there's a few different elements of that. The first thing I'd say is that it definitely would have been a lot better, insofar as we're doing COVID challenge studies. That's a good thing to do. It'd be more useful if we had started them, 9 months ago and started preparation a year ago or something like that. But I think there are still useful questions to answer, because I think there still is more vaccine development to be done and more treatment development to be done, either in the, figuring out, can we develop vaccines that are intranasal rather than given by a shot, or that are one dose, that are easier to transport, things like that. And the challenge studies could have a role in doing that, or in helping develop treatments. Now I want to briefly talk about, in my last minute or so, some of the arguments against COVID challenge studies. Obviously we at One Day Sooner have a particular view, and our view is that the risks here are very real, but are much less than the benefits, and are in line with other risks people take, like with kidney donation or childbirth. But I think there are good arguments against challenge studies, and I want to briefly walk through some of them. One of the arguments is this idea that COVID is a deadly disease, and even among young, healthy people. And there's one concept that, well, we shouldn't do challenge studies that are potentially deadly if we don't have a rescue therapy. And I think the thing that's good about this standard is it's clear, it's easy to understand. And so I think that there's an argument in its favor. But we One Day Sooner prefer thinking in terms of kind of absolute risk and risk versus benefit. And I think one problem with this rescue therapy standard is it doesn't actually include cases like influenza or RSV, both of which are diseases that are rarely deadly among young, healthy people, but can in fact be deadly in those populations, and which don't have this rescue therapy. The second thing, a concern is that there's this unpredictable risk of longer term symptoms from the disease. And I think this is a very serious concern, something we care about quite a bit. And I also think questions of to me, what's important is that volunteers are protected, and so that they're observed, and so we know and can learn about which people have longer term symptoms, which don't. We can maybe even start to generate some hypotheses about why some people have them and some people don't. And I think it's important that people are given healthcare and are given compensation for any of these long-term symptoms. And the final thing that was mentioned by the World Health Organization in a meeting they did in December is they had a lot of concerns of, well, look, we're doing this massive, almost unprecedented vaccine rollout, And the last thing we need is any possible thing that could contribute to vaccine hesitancy, even if it were by being misinterpreted. And so the concern is, or a concern is that you're deliberately exposing people to infection, deliberately causing people to be infected, and that could be transmuted or misunderstood as people are trying to infect us, or it could cause vaccine hesitancy in some way. And that has been an argument that there could be these unintended effects of challenge studies. And I think that's a cogent argument, but I do think there's to me, my reply to it or concern with it would be that I think it sort of proves too much and has kind of a chilling effect on the kind of research you can do. And instead, in terms of a long-term sustainable or having kind of progress in the field, it's better to be learning how to fight vaccine hesitancy directly and how to like measure this issue directly rather than preemptively not doing studies. So that's kind of my overview of what is One Day Sooner, what are challenge studies, what are some of the benefits and risks of a COVID challenge study. And with that, I will turn it back to Adnan.
Thank you very much, Josh. Really appreciate that. If you could stop sharing the slides, we'll get on. First of all, your point about representation is really important in trials. I think we'll come back to this whole notion of the correlates of protection, and then come back to your last slide, which is some of the issues around the sort of cons, and see what are the ethical dimensions in those. So wonderful, wonderful setting up the stage. And I'm so excited that this stage is now well set for Dr. Holly Fernandez-Lynch to come on board. Dr. Lynch is the John Russell Dixon Presidential Assistant Professor of Medical Ethics in the Department of Medical Ethics and Health Policy at the Perelman School of Medicine at UPenn, University of Pennsylvania. She also supports online education. But really her expertise is in things like looking at the ethics of and legal issues around payments to research participants, human infection challenge studies, and Dr. Lynch has also launched the consortium to advance effective research ethics oversight. What I think is really important for today's discussion is that Dr. Lynch published a paper in the American Journal of Bioethics, which was really how we started interacting with Josh and her around promoting ethical payment in human infection challenge studies. And when that paper came out, we were very, very interested and so happy today that we can welcome you to participate in our webinar. Over to you, Holly, for your conversation. Thank you so much.
Great, and thank you for having me. So Josh has set things up really nicely, kind of laying out the ethical issues related to COVID challenge studies, why they might be a good idea, despite us having, a number of vaccines that have been demonstrated to be safe and effective. And so what I'm going to do is talk about the issues that might come up in the context of paying people who decide to participate in COVID challenge studies. Oh, it doesn't want to let me advance. And so I have an important disclosure, which is that Josh and I had connection over this past summer, in which One Day Sooner commissioned from an expert working group a report on the ethics of paying participants in human infection challenge studies more generally, with a focus on COVID challenge studies. And so that's the report that you kind of see a screen grab from here. The URL is on the screen in case you're interested in taking a look at it. And so, the goal was to guide payment proposals as researchers were developing these COVID challenge trial protocols, but we had a very quick turnaround time. We developed this report in only about 2.5 weeks. And so, as there's a cliched quote about, I'm sorry, I didn't write this more briefly. I didn't have the time. It was a massive report because we had so little time to kind of whittle it down to the key elements. And I just want to emphasize that we did not review any specific protocol. We did not set forth a specific amount of money that would be reasonable to pay, but instead developed a framework for thinking about these questions. We also had a wide variety of people on the working group, some of whom were more skeptical than others about the value of challenge studies in general and in the context of SARS-CoV-2. So our group did not take any position on the ethics necessarily of proceeding with these studies at that point or at this point, but we assumed that they could be done ethically. If they couldn't be, then we wouldn't be getting to this issue of payment at all. When we had a bit of time to kind of catch our breath after putting out the main report, we narrowed things down to a more digestible, but still, fairly long paper in the American Journal of Bioethics, which you see here. And another talk I gave on this, I had a nice slide that had all of our photos on it. So I do just want to kind of thank my co-authors on this, but we have a big caveat, which is that we all are coming from very well-off countries. The people who were represented in this working group stem from the United States, Canada, and the UK. So we recognized a significant blind spot with regard to the perspectives and expertise that we were bringing, which matters when you think about the culture and ethics of paying research participants. So the goals of the paper, as I mentioned, were to offer a general framework to guide a variety of stakeholders in thinking about payment for challenge studies. So, how should researchers come up with amounts? How should ethics committees be reviewing these payments? And what should prospective participants be thinking about, with regard to acceptable payment? And then we also wanted to kind of hone in to ask whether challenge studies raise any unique questions when it comes to payment, or whether those questions are the same as any other payment in human subjects research. And then more specifically, whether SARS-CoV-2 challenge trials would be unique given the risks that are associated with an emerging infectious disease for which we don't yet have a cure. Again, the goal was not to propose any specific payment amounts. Now, this all became much more salient because now there is, in fact, a plan to proceed with a COVID challenge trial in the United Kingdom. Josh may know whether they actually have launched this. I keep seeing that they are set to launch, that they have a plan to enroll up to 90 volunteers between the ages of 18 and 30 in this study. The website is still pretty opaque with regard to when the trial will be starting, what it would actually entail, but they do have the necessary approvals. And the idea is really at this very first stage just to see how much virus it takes to infect people. They will not be providing them with vaccines at this stage of the challenge. So the key considerations when we're thinking about payment in research generally are making sure that we're not interfering with adequate informed consent, that we're treating the participants fairly, both individually and across the groups from which they might be recruited, and that we're getting enough people to participate in the study so that we can answer our important scientific question, but that we're not paying people so much that they think, maybe I should not be so straight with the researchers about the risk factors that I might have or the adverse events that I'm experiencing, because then I won't get paid, right? We have to also be thinking about the possibility of deception and more broadly questions about trust in research. So I'm going to walk you really quickly through the basic payment framework that some colleagues and I had developed before starting this particular report, right? So think about this as the basic payment framework for clinical research generally. So you might reimburse people for their out-of-pocket expenses, right? The amount of money that they have to spend to get to the clinic, to park their car, to get a babysitter, to get meals if they're going to be away from home for, the whole day. And that is justified on the basis of just treating people fairly and assuming that they should not have to pay out of their own pocket to contribute to socially valuable research. There's no real ethical concerns about paying people too much in terms of reimbursement. Instead, the concern would be insufficient payment, which is treating people unfairly. You start to get some ethical concerns when you think about compensating people. And this would be a type of payment that's offered for the time that people are contributing to research, the burdens that they undertake, the inconvenience that they experience with the research. Again, you want to treat people fairly. They are providing a service that is going to help advance generalizable knowledge, and they're taking on burdens to do that. So you have to worry about paying people too little. Right? If you compensate them at an amount that is too low, then you're exploiting their contributions to the research. But on the other side, what people are more typically worried about is undue influence. And this would be associated with payments that are higher as a research participant than people might be able to get outside of the study, in such a way that maybe you would think that people will be motivated to make a bad judgment against their own interests to be in research that is too risky for them. And there are all sorts of safeguards that we can take, including independent ethical oversight of research before we even offer people the opportunity to participate, and consent supports and other things to help make sure that we can adequately compensate them while minimizing concerns about undue influence. Now, we also have to make sure that we're compensating people in the event that harm befalls them, right? So before I was talking about burdens and inconvenience, but you might actually have some medical expenses or may not be able to go to work, and we need to make sure we're compensating people for that. And then finally, we might need to incentivize people to enroll so that we have adequate enrollment in our study, adequately diverse enrollment in our study. And here we might have concerns about undue influence as well. But again, there's this balance, right? We think the research is ethical to proceed. How are we going to make sure that we get enough people to enroll? Now, part of what Josh had asked us to do is think about whether we need a special payment framework for COVID challenge trials and challenge trials more generally. And we decided, no, we don't, right? There's public trust issues in all types of research. And in fact, you might inhibit public trust by exploiting people by paying them too little. The risks associated with challenge trials are on par with risks that we see in other types of research involving healthy individuals. This research can have significant social value, and the concerns about undue inducement are no different in these challenge trials than they might be in other research. So we thought this basic payment model can apply in these circumstances as well, but there might be some specific factors that we want to pay close attention to in the context of what I'm calling HICS, human infection challenge studies. And I'm sure Josh could tell you there's a lot of debate in the field about what we should be calling these things. So, if we're talking about appropriate amounts to pay people, we don't have to worry too much about whether there's direct medical benefit when we're thinking about challenge trials, because typically there won't be. But you do want to make sure that if people withdraw early, which is their right, that they are still paid for the time and contributions that they made to the research up to that point. You need to consider where the research is being done, right? The same way, minimum wage might vary from location to location. You need to know what's the cost of living, what are the other opportunities to make money in that location, so that you can contextualize the amount that's being offered in the research. And that relates to economic vulnerability, right? So of course, we don't want to, separate from payment, we don't want to target individuals or communities just because you think they're more likely to enroll because they're otherwise vulnerable, right? You need to have a good reason to recruit from a particular population. But if you do have a good reason, then it's reasonable to pay people. Otherwise, you risk exploiting their contributions. You have to think about whether, when you're designing the study and getting it funded, whether you're keeping in mind the fact that you need to reimburse and compensate people. Sometimes researchers say, oh, I'd love to pay, but I just don't have the money to do it. Well, when should we let researchers off the hook? And when should we say, no, you've got to, as a condition of ethical research, make sure you have enough money to pay people an appropriate amount. And then, of course, we always need to pay attention to what participants think is appropriate, right? Why are they enrolling in the research? Is it because they are focused on money? And by the way, that doesn't mean that it's a problem, right? A lot of people do their jobs because they're getting paid, right? The fact that you are only doing something to get paid does not necessarily mean that there is an ethical concern. Now, I don't have very much time, so I just want to very briefly, highlight a few key factors that might influence the amount of payment for a challenge study. The longer that you need to be isolated or kept in confinement, the more payment would be appropriate. The more discomfort and risk you might be exposed to would suggest a need for greater compensation and potentially higher incentives. And then, you might have a group of altruists, right? So Josh and a team of researchers has done, they've posted a preprint with regard to thinking about those who have volunteered to enroll in COVID challenge studies. And it looks like there's a lot of altruists in the group. So if you have people who are altruistically motivated, then you probably don't need to pay them incentives. You do still need to compensate them for their time. You might be thinking about, well, how much diversity do we need to have in our sample? Now, Josh mentioned that challenge studies already are a model and they involve a relatively small number of people. And so there may be lower critical need for diverse enrollment compared to what you would think about in a typical clinical trial that's intended to be more reflective of the population of interest. There might be some stigma associated with payment and accepting payment to, take on risks. And then another big concern is whether there's adequate ethical oversight of the challenge trial in the first instance. So, part of the reason why I think payment is okay is that it should only be offered to people when an independent ethics review body has decided that the research is ethical. If you have any qualms about whether the research is ethical, you shouldn't be doing the research. And whether to pay people or not pay people is not going to make the research ethical. Okay, and so you need to make sure you have adequate ethics oversight. This is just a quick screen grab of a worksheet, a little an element of the worksheet that we put together that we thought would be helpful for researchers and review bodies that were trying to think about the elements that might play a role in the amount of payment that should be offered. And then just finally, by way of summary, you can read this, if this video gets posted. The thing that I want to flag is that sometimes ethics reviewers get worried about payment being too high. And I think the reason for that is sometimes that they're worried about whether the research is ethically appropriate in the first instance. Okay, and we have to make sure that we're separating those two things. If the research is not ethically appropriate, and we can have this debate about COVID challenge studies, you shouldn't do it. You cannot make it ethically appropriate just by paying people enough. And certainly you don't make it ethically appropriate by withholding payment from people. And with that, I will close and turn things over to Paul.
Thank you so much, Holly. That was a great overview, not only of your paper, but also of what I think is key, the bioethics framework. And thank you for actually publishing that, because I think it's so important for us, not only in terms of the current pandemic, but also in terms of our frameworks in the field of bioethics. And I hope that towards the end, we can come back to some of the other concerns you've raised in terms of diversity, stigma, and the ethics review processes, especially from a global perspective. And I might come back to you on this issue of undue inducement and the notions of undue inducement in research. So very much appreciate that. So finally, I'm going to request my colleague, Dr. Paul Ndebele, to discuss some of these issues that Holly and her colleagues published and the collaboration with One Day Sooner. Dr. Paul Ndebele is well known to many of you who've attended our webinars. He's our senior research regulatory specialist here at the Milken Institute School of Public Health. Paul is also professorial lecturer in the Department of Global Health. He teaches an extensive array of bioethics courses, is a huge resource for us. With his extensive experience, he spent over 15 years in Africa, leading institutions in the field of research ethics and bioethics, and has been trained both in South Africa and here at the NIH. So Paul, over to you for some reflections on the framework and some perspectives from your experience.
Thanks so much, Adnan. So thanks, Josh, for giving us this background information about human challenge studies. And thanks to Holly for laying down the framework by describing this work that you went into to look into issues around payments for people who engage in COVID-19 human challenge studies. And as Adnan mentioned, we actually responded to this very, very interesting paper that was written by Holly and our colleagues. So that's the paper that I'm flighting right there. But basically, when we saw this this paper, we thought that it was very, very timely in view of the current situation we are in as society. The idea is we have to find ways of ensuring that we get ourselves, quick and fast out of this situation. So whichever way we're going to use, it's worth checking on as a society. We're also emphasizing here that as society, we need to design trials that improve efficiency in addressing main societal challenges. I saw someone actually mentioned issues around warp speed. It's all about ensuring that we save human lives. But more importantly too, human challenge studies should be adequately justified. And of course, there should be adequate safety measures that are put in place to minimize potential harms And Josh actually described some of those issues. But we also want to emphasize here on the issue of voluntariness, mainly emphasizing on the issue of understanding. We are saying that people who are getting themselves into human challenge studies should clearly understand what they are getting themselves into. So I like the fact that Josh has already said there are some individuals that are willing, that are actually looking forward to participating in these, but more importantly, they need to understand what they are getting themselves into, so that whatever happens at the end of it, they are not going to regret, but they will keep on saying that they actually sacrificed as individuals for the benefit of mankind. So what are some of the issues that we discussed when we're actually looking at this paper by Holly and colleagues? So as Holly mentioned, their discussions were mainly based on 18 human challenge studies that were conducted in high income countries. And the payments that they were actually looking at in this paper range from $386 to $8,938 with hourly payment rates of up to $38. And we are currently having discussions about raising the minimum wage here in the US up to $15. And yet, when we are looking at the global picture, we're talking about others who are making actually like $1 per day or even less. So we're going to talk about some of those issues later on. But more importantly too, Holly actually mentioned that their committee was made up of stakeholders from high income countries. So hence what they were actually discussing then actually apply so much to high income countries. But then for us now as individuals with an interest in global issues, we put on our global heads and then said, what can we do? What ideas can we add to their own thinking, so that at the end of the day, we're not simply thinking about issues that are happening in high income countries. We are also thinking about operationalizing this framework in low and middle income countries. When you look at issues around payments in low and middle income countries, there are numerous papers that have been written on this very, very interesting topic. So this is why Adnan actually mentioned issues around undue inducement. There are, concerns that are always coming up, to the extent that so many low and middle income countries have actually introduced some caps on payment. I know South Africa is one of those countries that have actually introduced a cap on payment. You can't go beyond that particular cap. But there are also discussions right now about sharing the burdens and benefits of research between low and middle income countries and also high income countries, with lots of voices from the low and middle income countries to the effect that they are being excluded in some of these complex trials. So right now, there are lots of efforts to ensure that low and middle income countries actually participate in these complex trials. So there are efforts to build their capacities. There are so many organizations that are actually looking into this. For example, EDCTP is actually looking into strengthening capacities for complex trials in African countries. And of course, we have to acknowledge that during the past, a few human challenge studies have been conducted in low and middle income countries. For example, in Guinea, in Kenya, in Gabon, in Mali, Tanzania, and Thailand. And most of them were actually focusing on some of those diseases that were mentioned by Josh during his segment. We're looking at diarrhea, or we are looking at malaria and others. But when you are looking at global research, there are also concerns around ethics dumping, where we actually are looking at the possibility of exporting research that cannot be conducted within the US. We export it to other countries where they've got weak regulatory environments. So once we think about ethics dumping, we are then saying we need to think clearly about these issues before we proceed with those trials. When you look at issues around payments in low and middle income countries, Holly mentioned the models, the reinvestment, compensation, and the incentive payment models. But we argue that these do not make much sense when you're looking at environments of high unemployment and serious poverty. If someone is going to be walking to the trial site, you cannot be talking about reimbursement because they simply walked. If someone is in an environment where they are unemployed or they are making less than $1 per day, how do you value their contribution in that particular environment? So we're saying that these models, when we're looking at low and middle income countries, they're actually weakened by the higher levels of poverty that often force individuals to take extreme risks. For example, we often hear about individuals who are crossing the oceans in these very, very dangerous boats, trying to cross over to Europe. We also even hear of individuals who sell their organs for a few dollars. Some are selling their kidneys. It's all about trying to survive. So they always try and find ways of finding some money. And recently in Kenya, there was a newspaper headline, "Do you want cash? Volunteers for a dose of malaria parasites." Right? So basically there was an institution in Kenya which was advertising for human challenge studies. And this was now a headline in one of the national newspapers to say, if you want cash, go and volunteer for these human challenge studies. The message was not that, please volunteer for the human challenge studies. The message was, if you want cash, please go and volunteer. So we realized then that this has got a different meaning. So we have actually suggested in our paper that we need to consider additional factors. We need to consider the average income in the other countries. We also suggested that research ethics committees in those countries should play an important role in looking at the impacts of the large payments that they were actually looking at within their studies, emphasizing that large payments by a few studies might actually serve as a disadvantage for other studies within those countries, because now individuals in those countries might actually now end up refusing to participate in some of those studies that pay low amounts and simply look up for those ones that are paying lots more. So we're actually emphasizing on harmonization of payments within countries and also across studies, so that at the end of the day, we are able to conduct research in low and middle income countries. We're also emphasizing that research ethics committees, researchers, and sponsors should also consider the engagement of communities and, more importantly, improving informed consent. More importantly, too, there is also the need to consider the risks to third parties. If someone is infected whilst they're participating in a study, that person actually lives in a community and lives with others. It's actually possible that through that infection, it might actually impact on others in a negative way. We're also emphasizing on the provision of other indirect benefits that go to communities or even countries or institutions that will be participating in those trials, as a way of moving away from those large payments that are actually focusing on the individuals. So, for example, with regards to the payment worksheet that Holly showed us at the end, we're actually emphasizing the addition of additional columns to that worksheet. One of them actually looking at the average local wages being earned in that particular country. We're also looking even at coming up with a measure of economic vulnerability within that particular country. Also, a list of the direct benefits that are going to the individuals who are going to participate, but also a list of the indirect benefits that might actually be proposed for the countries or the institutions involved. And more importantly, focusing on the strategies that researchers are going to utilize to ensure that participants truly appreciate the implications of volunteering within that particular study. So when you look at human challenge studies and COVID-19 vaccines, I am happy that Josh has actually discussed a lot of the issues that I'm highlighting in this particular slide. But I want to emphasize on the last statement there, where we are looking at altruism, and emphasizing that when we are looking at those ones who are participating for altruism, what we should emphasize on is the informed consent and not issues around the money. So emphasizing that we need to de-emphasize the money when it comes to participation in such a trial where right now we do not have the effective treatment or the rescue that was mentioned by Josh. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paul. Appreciate those points, particularly from the perspective of LMICs. And I think it's great that we can have this perspective. I want to very quickly move into picking up some of the points that people have picked up. And I want to thank all three of you for presenting today. And folks, if you have further reflections and comments, please drop them in the chat board so we can pick them up now, or our speakers can actually pick them up even in and continuing the discussions on social media. But Josh, let me ask you first about the need for human challenge studies. Let's go back because you pointed that out and you talked about the pros and cons. But the rapidity with which vaccines have already been developed and are already out there, what are your thoughts? Do you think there is still a role? Are you still convinced that there is a need for that?
I am, so I think the challenges can be useful for a few different reasons. Still at this course in the pandemic, I mean, one thing to realize is that there's still thousands of people dying every day, and that large sections of the world, there's no plan to be able to vaccinate them before the end of the year. So I think that things that can improve our fundamental understanding of the illness, even of the virus that causes it, even if those improvements are small or speculative, that it might not improve things at all, I still think that the absolute benefit is going to outweigh the harm to the volunteers by a meaningful amount. And at that point, the question is, are there volunteers who want to participate in these studies, fully understanding what the risks and potential benefits are? And I think that the studies still kind of clear that hurdle. I think, it's possible that we will learn some interesting things about the virus that may be helpful for developing treatments, may be helpful for public health guidance, may not. But it's also possible that we might be developing a tool that will be useful for getting further treatments, getting further vaccines, and developing correlates of protection that can be helpful more directly in a really powerful way. Or if something goes wrong and issues come up with different viral strains and evading vaccine protection, the challenge model might be very successful. So I think it's really worthwhile to do, especially this initial infectious dosing study, to develop the model in the first place.
Yeah, well, I think that makes sense. I think there is, I think closing doors on methodologies is always should be done with great caution. So Holly, I think we have to address this issue of undue inducement. I think there is a lot of interest. So talk to us a little bit about your perspectives on that.
Yeah, I know I glossed over this because I was trying to go very quickly, but it's fundamental to this discussion. So it partly depends on how you define these areas of ethical concern. In the paper and in other work that I've done, I've set coercion aside completely, because the way that I am most convinced the best definition of coercion is a threat of harm to someone, right? I am going to, you've got a gun to your head and it's your money or your life, that's not what we're talking about when we are thinking about offering people money to participate in research. That puts us into the category of undue inducement or undue influence. And the best definition of that ethical concern is that you're offering somebody an excessive reward to make a decision that will go against their interests, right? That to take on an unreasonable level of risk or to do something that will likely cause them an unreasonable amount of harm. And so it's not mere influence, right? Undue influence is different from mere influence. As I mentioned, people get paid to go to work. People get paid to do all sorts of things. People might decide to be in research that they otherwise would not decide to be in because they're being paid. We only have to worry about undue inducement if we think that they are being induced to do something that's bad for them. And so that's why it's important. I was hammering home this idea of like, are the studies themselves ethical? If you are confident in the ethics of the research, then it does not become unethical to pay people. And I think the best example of this, and I'd be interested in whether our audience here is convinced by it. If it's ethical for me to mow my neighbor's lawn for free, then it's ethical for me to mow their lawn for $5, for $50, for $50 million, right? It's the money does not affect the ethics of the underlying activity. And so if we feel confident in the research, then we should feel confident asking people to participate in it and confident that they're going to make a reasonable judgment. Now, if you are really worried that they are going to be taking on unacceptable risks, then the solution to that is to address the risks of the research, not to pay them less or pay them nothing. And so, I appreciate your commentary, Paul and Adnan, on the paper that we wrote. My view is that the basic ethical framework for payment can apply in high income countries and in low income and middle income countries. Economic vulnerability might make research participation more attractive, just as it might make other risky endeavors more attractive. But if we feel like those endeavors are okay to ask people to do for no money, then they should be okay to ask people to do for money. And so I'm not so convinced about, the kind of covert kidney sales or other things that are really high risk. Because if we are that worried about the research, we shouldn't be doing it if it raises that level of risk.
So I'll come back to you, Holly, but let me make sure, Paul, you do agree that payments for research can be acceptable and have been done in low and middle income countries for a long time. So what are your thoughts in response to what Holly just said? Because I'm going to come back to her on a very particular thing she said, but Paul, just want to check in with you.
Thank you, Adnan. Responding to what Holly just mentioned concerning question, I'm actually looking at someone who is living in that impoverished environment. I'm actually looking at that environment as posing a gun to their head, right? And forcing them to participate in whatever is available, for them to make a living. So this is why I gave those, examples. Clearly, if people get to know that there is a place that is going to be paying so much, they're not thinking about all these informed consent things that you're talking about. When you are trying to talk to them about informed consent, for them, they're saying, please just give me the form, I want to sign. They're not thinking about the risks involved. You want to tell them, but what they're simply thinking about is the money at the end of the day. So those are my concerns.
No, thanks, Paul. And Josh, in your experience, let's talk about experience here, not theories. In your experience with One Day Sooner, how have you found recruitment vis-a-vis payment? What is the experiential lessons that you've learned at One Day Sooner?
So it's important to keep a couple of things in mind. So the first is, the people who come to One Day Sooner, we've never advertised. So they're finding us and are expressing their desire to be in the challenge study. And, most people who've signed up earlier in the pandemic. And so generally the One Day Sooner volunteer population, has been very motivated, not by compensation. And in fact, like they're, One Day volunteer population is probably was more interested in limiting compensation than I was, certainly. But so that's one side of things, and you can see this also in the preprint that Holly mentioned that I shared in the chat of a survey of the attitudes of 2,000 of our earlier volunteers. On the other hand, I should make it clear that we've identified we sent out a questionnaire to we have about 3,000 British volunteers, and trying to figure out which ones of them might be eligible for this COVID challenge study. And so we had about 150 that filled out that seemed like they'd be eligible. And we've connected them to the trial team, but a lot of the people and probably most of the people who've been in the UK COVID challenge study so far haven't been kind of going directly through One Day Sooner, and have been going through the recruitment of the contract research organization Open Orphan that's running the studies. And so I do think there could very well be a difference between the population who are in the studies and like the One Day Sooner volunteer population. So I don't want to speak, for
No, I think that's a very fine distinction. So Holly, here's the issue. Nothing is ethical or unethical. Everything is about gradations, and it's managing risk-benefit ratios. So to say that if you believe that something underlying is ethical, therefore, I think that premise is a little challenging for those of us involved in research, because even in an LMIC or a high-income country context, it's about managing risks and benefits. And so the contention of a number of people on the chat, and it looks like Paul and colleagues as well, is that you can have an overpowering influence which will allow people to take a risk which they ordinarily would not take. So I ordinarily would not sit in a car without seatbelts. But if I know that at the end of that car ride, I'm going to get, $50, I may say, hell with the seatbelts, I'm jumping in this car. So where do you stand on that analysis?
Yeah, I still kind of am going to stick with what I was arguing before. You're absolutely right that there's no such kind of in the ether something is ethical. It's always a balance between the risks to the individual versus the benefits to that individual and to society more broadly. And we ask independent ethics review bodies to make that judgment independent of payment. At least in the US, that's what our regulatory bodies advise IRBs to do. So if you feel confident that the risks that people are being asked to undertake are acceptable, then in my view, they do not become unacceptable when you offer them payment, no matter how high that payment is, and no matter how influential that payment is. Now, and part of the reason I believe this is because I analogize research participation when we're talking about healthy participants like work. Right? It is a job. It is a type of activity that people can undertake to make money. I don't feel that they have to be altruistic necessarily in their motivations. And so when we think about work that we ask people to undertake, we want to make sure that there are ethical working conditions, of course, right? But some jobs are riskier than others. And I don't think many people, probably not in the chat, would argue that we ought to pay firefighters less because they, are exposed to risk, or other jobs that involve risk. Or you might even think about teachers who have been asked to stay in the classroom in the context of COVID and taking on that risk. Very few people would suggest that those individuals should make less money, but rather that those risks and burdens associated with those endeavors should mean they should get more money. So that's the view that I take about this. And I think the concern about an overwhelming influence is a real one, right? I mean, I get Paul's point about, not having other options to make money. That is a concern if what you are being asked to do is sell a kidney, or, undertake some unreasonable risk where you feel like that is your only option, to care for your family or to meet your financial needs. But if what you're being asked to do is a reasonable thing, then I'm not worried about paying people to do it.
So I think that's very clear. I think this is a very, very interesting dialogue. Unfortunately, time is not our friend here. We can probably keep going on. I do want to say that this is incredibly important. I think the work that Josh, you and One Day Sooner is doing is incredible to ensure representation and participation. I think, Holly, your framework is generic enough to be worthy of discussing across different countries and for IRBs to discuss. So thank you very much for that contribution. But I do think that some of the points that Paul and many people on the chat are raising are very, very fundamental. We know nothing is black and white. I think it's all about the gray analysis, but also it's not about, it's also very important to understand where those decisions occur. So if local IRBs, local ethics committees in the Ghanas and the Ugandas and the Indias of the world determine something is acceptable or not, that is better for me than a global body and a global organization trickling down. And I know everybody is nodding their head, so we are all in agreement with respect to those types of issues. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much. Tremendous thanks to Josh, Holly, and Paul for that debate. I'm sorry that we didn't have more time. Please keep that conversation going. We will come back next month with a different series around last week of April. We'll come back with a new COVID and ethics webinar. This time we will be most probably going to a region, a different part of the world on April 20th. I want to thank our speakers again. Please continue the dialogue and debate. Holly, One Day Sooner, Paul, everybody is on social media, so we can keep the discussion going. Thank you so much for your participation. And once again, thanks to our presenters. Take care, folks. Bye now.